Hello everybody, I hope you're all well. That is a new series on TikTok which really caught my attention. It's called Boy Room, and it's where this very funny presenter goes around men's bedrooms in New York and basically gives them interior decoration ideas. It's obviously meant to be a funny series and I do find it funny, but obviously me being me, it sparked a lot of thought within me. On this series, there are men who are in their late 20s and early 30s who don't have bed sheets, who keep all of their clothes in a plastic tub, no decoration or warmth, and of course these spaces are quite messy and dirty. And this series really got me thinking, why are boys' bedrooms like that? Why do I know at least 5 women who have had their lives completely ruined by a man who doesn't have a bed frame? Why do so many single men have navy bed sheets? Why do so many men seemingly not care about their living spaces, to decorate it, to make it nice and warm, to keep it clean and tidy, when in contrast, so many women do invest that time and effort and money? I spoke to you guys over on my Instagram story when I began researching for this video, and my DMs have never been a more terrifying place. I had DMs from you guys saying that one of your male friends hasn't washed his bed sheets since July. I also got multiple DMs from people saying that their boyfriends didn't own bed frames until they moved in together. One of you guys told me that your boyfriend only used fabric softener to wash his bed sheets, that he didn't use washing up powder. And I find this all absolutely fascinating because obviously this doesn't apply to every single man, but it applies to enough men for it to be noteworthy. You know, why do so many grown men who are in their late 20s and early 30s not invest the time or the effort to make their living spaces nice in comparison to women? Like, there is a huge gender divide here. And obviously I have 1,000,001 disclaimers to add into this video because I don't want anyone to take this the wrong way. When discussing the widespread phenomenon of why are men's bedrooms like that, this obviously does not apply to every single man. Secondly, I'm talking about financial barriers, mental health, and neurodivergencies aside here. I have ADHD, so I know how difficult it can be to keep a space clean and tidy. You guys do not want to look at my living room right now. You guys will never know. I am coming at this from an angle of exploration and analysis rather than ridicule. I want to talk about the socialization differences between boys and girls and how that impacts them growing up. I want to talk about weaponized incompetency. I want to talk about the household labor inequity between men and women. And of course, I want to answer the most important question: why do so many men have navy bed sheets? And just before we get into it, I would love to thank Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. Woo! Another Skillshare sponsor. Love you, Skillshare. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives where they bring together teachers and members with a really broad range of classes. You name it, Skillshare probably has a class on it. I'm talking about productivity, graphic design, learning an instrument, essay writing, looking after houseplants, learning how to use Notion, starting a business, keeping your books in order. And Skillshare has a learn by doing approach. So when you finish a class, you can submit a project. And my favorite part about Skillshare is that they are on-demand stackable lessons. So you can go at whatever pace you like, whichever pace works for you. You can take 4 lessons in 1 week and then 1 the next if you're busy. It really does work for anyone who has a little bit of an up and down schedule like myself. The Skillshare class I decided to take this month was Creative Confidence and Silencing Your Inner Critic. As someone who's not only self-employed, but I have a very front-facing job. I put a lot of myself and my soul into my work. So of course, nobody is harsher on me than myself. And suffering from imposter syndrome can really impact myself and also how I work. It can really, really slow me down and it can make working a pretty negative experience, which I don't like because I absolutely love my job. But with this Skillshare class, I have learned a few skills to try and connect with my inner creativity again. I've learned how to build creative confidence, grow my creative confidence, power my creativity, and also learn to overcome my critical voice and tools to cultivate more confidence within my work. The first 500 people to sign up using my link will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So make sure you click my link in the description to start your learning journey today. And thank you so much again, Skillshare, for sponsoring today's video, and let's get into it. As as I mentioned earlier, the most common complaints of men's bedrooms is no bed frame, navy bed sheets, a general lack of decoration and warmth, and also the space being generally quite messy and dirty. And nothing better displays this phenomenon than the TikTok series Boy Room. And I want to make this clear that this is obviously absolutely no hate to the people who create Boy Room and also the host of Boy Room. I actually think that she's really funny, but this series just makes a perfect case study for this video. I couldn't resist. The men who were in these TikToks didn't have bed sheets, didn't clean or tidy their space, didn't have like drawers to keep their clothes in. One of them just kept their clothes in a plastic tub. And although the host of Boy Room does give them some decoration ideas, she doesn't actually go in and decorate the space. I feel like Boy Room is a perfect representation of how men will live in unkept spaces until a woman in their life decides to sweep in and become an interior decorator, and it's basically all sorted for them. But I do want to give all of these commonalities of men's bedrooms their separate time to shine. I want to explore and find out everything about why men's bedrooms are like that. So let's start out with the no bed frame. And we can't talk about not having a bed frame without talking about Japanese bedding. Because when I was talking about this over on my Instagram, a few of you guys DM'd me with some concerns saying that there are cultural differences between some cultures choosing not to sleep on a traditional sort of Western bed frame. And of course, I will consider cultural differences. I've never been to Japan. I just learned this information from the internet, so take it with a grain of salt. But a traditional way of sleeping in Japan is sleeping without a bed frame. Instead, there is a tatami mat on the bottom, and on top of the tatami mat is a shiki futon, which is the mattress, and then there is a kakebuton, which is the duvet. To a Western eye, it appears that these beds aren't on bed frames, but it's not like the shiki futon is just on the floor. There is something separating the shiki futon and the floor, which is the tatami mat, which makes the floor more comfortable and breathable and also acts as a barrier for any moisture. There are a lot of benefits, obviously, to sleeping on a tatami mat. I've never slept on a tatami mat myself, but according to J-Life International, the benefits of the Japanese sleep system are cooler temperatures as the air settles on the floor. I can actually vouch for this because we're sidetracking. Back in my old flat, I lived in a split level mezzanine, which got so hot. My bed was on the top floor, so when it got really hot in the summer, me and Lem would sleep downstairs on the floor because it was cooler. Better circulation and reduced back and muscle pain, better spine alignment. They're eco-friendly because shiki futons are made from only cotton, and more space as the bed can be rolled away when it's not being used. But I think a vast majority of the men without bed frames movement haven't decided to make this change because they know the benefits of the Japanese sleep system. I don't feel like they're trying to improve their blood circulation. None of these men are sleeping on a shiki futon or using a tatami mat. Their IKEA mattress is just raw dogging the floor. Once again, I'm here to explore why? Firstly, there are quite a few men who actively choose not to have bed frames. I had one of my friends message me, he's 6'4", and he does have a bed frame. He made that very clear that he does have a bed frame, but he does actually prefer sleeping on just a mattress on the floor because when his limbs are dangling off the bed, they don't go numb. A lot of people prefer sleeping without bed frames because it's better for their back. A lot of people prefer sleeping without bed frames because it's quieter when you have sex. And you know what? I can actually vouch for this because me and my boyfriend recently changed to a bed frame that doesn't have a headboard, and shagging aside here, just tossing and turning on a really sort of like bad quality bed frame, it makes so much noise. But from my research, it seems that a lot of men who don't have bed frames, it's not necessarily an active choice for them not to have a bed frame. It's not like the men who don't have bed frames because it's better for their back or because they're too tall for a regular bed. It's rather more passive, and it seems to come from a place of complacency to their own living situation. So they may have moved into an unfurnished bedroom and buying a bed frame just isn't at the top of their priority list, or their last bed frame or springboard broke and they just haven't bought a new one. And I actually think it's very important for me to know note that although I did disclaim at the beginning of this video that I'm talking about financial barriers aside here, I think it would be a little bit naive of me to completely discount finances playing a role in a lot of men not having bed frames. A lot of men cite not replacing their bed frames or not having one in the first place as a matter of finances. They just didn't have that much money at the time and they would rather spend their money on something else. But that is what I find interesting, because this is a bed frame. This is something that you will use every single day for years to come. So why do so many men deprioritize buying a bed frame? Why does this rank so low in men's priorities compared to women's? And why just in general do men care a lot less about their living spaces and decorating them than women do? To quote Maria Yagoda for Vice, why do so many adult men keep their mattresses on the floor? For me, that tracks. I've dated more men than I feel comfortable admitting who've lived in New York for years without air conditioners, even though they can afford it and would benefit from one. Their own comfort came second to what? Toughness? Rugged, uncomfortable masculinity? Sex so sweaty it has to be stopped? They never had good reasons. They'd say things like, I've come this far, and leave it at that. Then there's the long-standing tension of domestic work, a category under which I'd plot bed frame concern and selection. According to a 2014 study, only 19% of men employed outside the house do housework, while 50% of women do. Now, the next thing I want to talk about with men's bedrooms, and this one's a little bit more funny and frivolous, but it is, why do so many single men have navy bed sheets? And why do so many women, including myself, hate them? Just to sort of share a little anecdote here, I hate navy bed sheets for my own personal reasons. When I was very, very young, me and my mum and my sister moved into my stepdad's flat, and he had been solely living in this flat by himself and decorated it completely on his own. And everything in this flat was navy blue. I'm talking the carpets, the sofas, the bath mat, the toilet seat. Everything was navy blue. And of course, the bed sheets. And because of this core memory, which happened whilst my brain was still forming, I am now completely averse to navy blue. But some other reasons why many women are averse to the color navy blue is you cannot see stains in navy blue bed sheets. And this is extremely unsettling because so many of you girls told me stories about how so many of your male friends or partners never washed their bed sheets, didn't know how often they were supposed to wash their bed sheets. I will never forget the DM of someone saying their male friend hadn't washed their bed sheets since July. But I don't want to write off so many single men having navy bed sheets down to the fact that they're just disgusting and they don't want to wash them that often, because I don't actually think that's always the case. Sometimes people prefer darker bed sheets because they don't want to have to do an entire bed sheet wash, which if you do wash your own bed sheets, then you will know that it will literally have you fighting for your life. They don't want to have to do an entire bedsheet wash just because they spilt a little bit of squash or a little bit of coffee on their bed like 2 days after they've washed them. I used to actually have dark grey bed sheets, so maybe I should just shut my mouth, but I used to have grey bed sheets because a few years ago I used to religiously fake tan, and I would get fake tan all over my sheets every single week. I wash my sheets every other week. A lot of men have navy bed sheets because it's what their mum bought them when they went to uni, and they haven't switched it up since. Another Vice article that I read, which was about the navy and maroon bed sheets phenomenon, was that navy blue and maroon are just grown up blue and red. And these are two colours that are not only associated as being like boy colours, but they are also associated with very popular football teams. Chelsea, Liverpool, Man United, Man City, Arsenal. And just to go back to my stepdad's navy hellhole of an old flat, his favourite colour is navy blue because he's a Tottenham supporter. And I know I'm saying in this video a lot that men have navy bed sheets and don't have bed frames because they don't care about their living spaces, but that's not always the case. I think as women, I mean, at least I'm talking for myself here, I tend to underestimate the constraints that men are under when it comes to being able to express themselves and decorate their living spaces. And I know it's not the biggest problem in the world, obviously, but straight men are sort of one wrong step away from being completely ridiculed by their male peers. So what bed sheets do they buy with trying to avoid any sort of ridicule? Maybe they should buy those London Underground ones. But I don't think that this sort of men ridiculing men is better displayed than in the recent fashion boy hate on TikTok. This is very British, so I'm not sure how many of you guys will be clued in on this. Around a month ago, there was a complete influx in hate towards sort of TikTok fashion boys. TikTok fashion boys, they talk about streetwear and Supreme, saying their content is cringe, making sort of like cringe compilations of what I would describe as pretty inoffensive content. And I honestly chalk it up to influencing and having an interest in fashion is seen as something which is quite effeminate. And I think a lot of men don't want to choose a duvet cover which is deemed too effeminate. So they play it safe with navy blue. But the problem is that all of them are playing it safe with navy blue. And I think if men had their slightly messy, cold spaces and women had their warm and decorated spaces, and that was that, then I would be a lot less bothered. But this no bed frame, non-decorated bedroom phenomenon is only rife amongst single men. As soon as men get into relationships, their living spaces become significantly nicer, and this is often at the expense of their girlfriend or wife. And I think this is what gets under my skin about Boy Room. And again, this is absolutely no hate to the girl who presents Boy Room. And I know she doesn't actually decorate the space, she just gives decor ideas. But to me, Boy Room exhibits the complacency of straight men. The fact that consciously or subconsciously, men are more than happy to live in a bedroom that doesn't have a bed frame, not keeping their space clean and tidy because they know that one day a woman will sweep into their life and basically do up interior decorator. And this is just in one place that men utilize weaponized incompetency. I hadn't heard the term weaponized incompetency until a few years ago, but if you have not heard of it, get ready, I'm about to rock your world. But it is the act in which men, whether consciously or subconsciously, when they have to do some sort of job around the house, they will do it poorly so they don't get asked to do it again. And when they do get pulled up on doing the job poorly, they often blame their partner for having too high standards and that they should just do it themselves. Weaponized incompetency comes in many forms. There's the obvious of when you're asked to do a chore, you do it badly, or not doing chores unless you are asked. Leaving the organization of social plans, whether it's with friends, with family, even the organization of things just between the two of you, like holidays and dates, down to your partner. Often citing reasons like, oh, well, they prefer organizing. Oh, their standards are really high as the reason to why you're not doing it. And weaponized incompetency obviously boils down to socialization. I think the stereotype that boys are just naturally messier than girls is beginning to fall out of graces of the younger generations. But many people and parents still believe this. According to Susan McHale, a professor of human development and family studies at Penn State, there's no evidence of inherent biologically based sex differences in cleanliness or messiness, which means that this all comes from somewhere, and obviously it starts with childhood. I read this absolutely fascinating article on The Atlantic about how, as adults, men having more leisure time than women, which is around half an hour, and American men on average watching half an hour more TV than American women, actually mirrors boys and girls in childhood. A 2019 analysis of government data by the Pew Research Center found that teenage boys between the ages of 15 to 17 had roughly an hour more leisure time than teenage girls in the same age bracket. On average, teenage boys spend an hour longer using screens than teenage girls. To quote Joe Pinsker for The Atlantic, parents can play a major role in generating these inequities. Research on housework suggests that parents introduce kids to tasks differently, depending on their gender. Mothers, for instance, tend to spend more time with their daughters cooking, doing housework, and shopping than they do with their sons. Fathers, meanwhile, are more likely to involve their sons in home improvement projects and leisure activities such as watching TV. Kids' activities are in part driven by their own parents' gender division of labor, says Jill Jaworski, a sociologist at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. These really mirror each other in a lot of ways. And something so unfortunate that this article brought my attention to is that there isn't just a gender pay gap in the workplace. There is a gender pay gap in children's allowance. To quote Joe Pinsker again, parents send other unequal messages to their children about the work they do around the house. According to data covering about 10,000 families released last year by BusyKid, an app for paying children allowance, the average boy earned $13.80 a week, while the average girl received $6.71, a pay gap at least as wide as the one between adult men and women in the workplace. It's worth noting that this gap, like the aforementioned disparities in time use, forms well before kids grow up and enter the workforce. And this data by BusyKid also showed that boys are more likely to be paid allowance for general upkeep, so things like brushing their teeth and showering, than girls, despite the fact that girls spend 23 minutes longer on personal upkeep as teenagers than boys, which once again mirrors the personal upkeep gap between adult men and women, which is around 28 minutes. And of course, the fact that daughters spend more time with their mothers and their mothers take on more household chores, it does make sense that in turn girls end up doing more chores than boys. It doesn't make it right, but it does make sense. But I also think that this disparity of chores and allowance does actually line up with the long recorded phenomenon that parents are more harsh on their daughters than their sons. I read an article on The Guardian about how mothers tend to be more critical of their daughters than their sons. And this is something that I've heard a lot from my friends as well. And I would like to say that this does obviously apply to fathers as well, but obviously there's going to be more studies and more what they called. This is going to be so annoying because I'm going to look back on this and be like, I know the word you were looking for. It's like when you go out and ask someone a question. Like you ask someone the same question, you gather the answers. This is really going to piss me off. I guess we're going to have to wait and see. Because the women do more child rearing and they're the more present parent, there's obviously going to be more research into mothers than fathers. But mothers are more likely to praise characteristics in their sons, referring to them as cheeky and funny and playful, but would reprimand their daughters for the same behaviours, often referring to them as stubborn and argumentative and stroppy. But one thing I will say is that it's not all doom and gloom. Mothers are far more likely to say that they feel emotionally closer to their daughters than their sons. But this disparity and inequity between chores and treatment as children does of course impact them as they grow up into adults. I think when we think of gender inequity, we tend to think of the pay gap. We tend to think of gender discrimination in the workplace. But a lot of gender inequality and inequity actually takes place within the household. And this is really difficult to pin down and get to the bottom to because you can, but it's a bit more difficult to implement laws like when you're implementing laws into a workplace. It's much easier to work out gender discrimination between co-workers than between a husband and wife. According to the European Institute for Gender Equality, about 91% of women with children spend at least an hour per day on housework, compared with 30% of men with children. The latest available data shows that employed women spend about 2.3 hours daily on housework. For employed men, this figure is 1.6 hours. And to quote The Atlantic, overall in the US, women clean more than men do. American men did an average of 15 minutes of housework each day, while women did 45. The casino's right. Most men, 77%, did no housework on any given day, while most women, 55%, did at least some. Obviously, socialization plays a huge role in why women tend to do more housework than men. But why, when men and women come together and form a household and they both work full time, why does this inequity still exist? Heterosexual households tend to function the same way that they did 50, 60 years ago, when a majority of American households were single income. A majority of the time, the man would go out and work and the woman would work within the home, meaning that she would rear children and do housework. And as the gender revolution began to have some real impact, alongside with inflation rising, women could go out and work, but also you couldn't really support a family on a single income anymore. A vast majority of American households and also UK households are double income. And when people talk about this, I feel like people tend to look back on the past with rose-tinted glasses and think that having a single income household was just the vibe. I think it's objectively good that women can go out and work. I think that economic independence within marriages is so incredibly important, because when any person is economically dependent on their partner, this is just an absolute breeding ground for abuse. But on the other hand, I think two things can be true at once. I think women's economic independence from their husbands is incredibly important, but also I think it's absolutely outrageous that a vast majority of families have to be double income in order to survive. I think it's absolutely outrageous that childcare is so ludicrously expensive in this country, and even when women do want to return to work, they are often pushed out of the workplace because it makes more financial sense for them to stay at home and look after their children than to pay for childcare. To put a child under 2 in nursery is £1,200 a month. But before we get into talking about childcare and maternity leave, I think when people push back on the idea that household labour should be divided equally between men and women, they tend to cite the reason of, oh, well, the man is the breadwinner, therefore he should take on less of the housework. And firstly, I was actually talking about this with my therapist, and he raised a really good point that regardless of who the breadwinner is, if you're both working an equal amount of hours, then the household labour should be divided equally as well. But let's just roll with this argument. Let's roll with this argument and say that the person who is the breadwinner should do less housework. Well, you'll be very disappointed to find out, if anyone agrees with this, that in the UK, 45% of women in heterosexual relationships are the breadwinner. And in America, 40% of women in heterosexual relationships are the breadwinner. These are very, very quickly becoming very outdated social norms, and we have a lot of catching up to do. And again, you guessed it, I read another really insightful article on The Atlantic. If The Atlantic has 0 fans, I'm dead. Titled, "Even Breadwinning Wives Don't Get Equality at Home." And not only does this article discuss the fact that both men and women alike are apprehensive to name the woman in the relationship the breadwinner, even if they are the breadwinner. Breadwinning wives also don't get parity in how household chores are divvied up. As wives' economic dependence on their husband increases, women tend to take on more housework. But the more economically dependent men are on their wives, the less housework they do. Even women with unemployed husbands spend considerably more time on household chores than their spouses. In other words, women's success in the workplace is penalized at home. That's right. So even when women do earn more money than their husbands do less housework. And work has a huge impact on the way that household labour is divided between men and women. This is something that I found really interesting, but if you're a man who works in a more female-dominated field like nursing, you are more likely to take on the more manly household chores like mowing the lawn and power hosing. And if you're a woman who works in a more male-dominated field like finance, you are more likely to take on the more feminine household chores like cooking and cleaning. And another thing this article talks about, this article was an absolute gold mine for research. But another thing that this article talks about is the fact that when men are unemployed, it's seen as a more urgent problem that must be fixed than when women are unemployed. And at first, you'll think, oh, that's really unfair on men, the poor men. I mean, partially true, but of course this all boils down to misogyny. Men's unemployment being seen as more problematic than a woman's unemployment actually boils down to women's employment being taken less seriously and being seen as expendable. To quote Aliyah Hamid Rao for The Atlantic, "A lawyer who had been the breadwinner in her marriage told me that after she lost her job, she turned her focus to her husband's business and how he could grow it, instead of worrying about how she could find another job to ensure that their family family remains financially stable. Ironically, her educational credentials and prior work experience mean that she is actually positioned to bring in more money than her husband. Instead of focusing on how the unemployed woman could get her next job, the couples I talked with focused their attention on ensuring that the husband's career was flourishing. But when a husband loses his job, there is a frenetic focus on his next job. It honestly, guys, it brings a tear to my eye seeing bad bitches dull their sparkle for a man. But another reason why women tend to take on more household labor than men is that women are far more likely to be at the brunt of social penalties for having an untidy living space than men. In fact, men and women perceive messiness in the same way, but they are both more likely to perceive a place as more messy if they think the occupant of that living space is a woman. When a man lives in a messy space, it is seen as messy because he just doesn't know how to clean. But when a woman's living space is messy, it is seen as an intentional choice or an active neglect. And I think this is the real stinger when it comes to weaponized incompetence, because these men are perfectly capable in their jobs. These men, they are surgeons. They work in finance. They have managed to climb the corporate ladder and make six figures. They are college graduates, but they can't load a dishwasher up properly. Sorry, but it's not a case of they can't do it. It's a case that they won't do it. And I think the social penalties play a huge part in why men and women's living spaces tend to be so different. Because if we just circle it back to the men without bed frames movement, women are far more likely to be on the receiving end of social penalties or condemnation for not having a bed frame. When a woman doesn't have a bed frame, it's seen as active. But when a man doesn't have a bed frame, it's seen as passive. But not all hope is lost, because men are very willing to take on household chores which aren't seen as feminine. And one of them is cooking. And when I first read this article, I was just pissed off because I was like, oh, you guys can do it, okay. Because men just get to pick and choose what chores they want to put their all into based on how much they enjoy it. And cooking is seen as a more leisurely chore than hoovering. Cooking is a lot more rewarding than hoovering, in my opinion. To quote Olga Kazan for, you guessed it, The Atlantic, surprisingly, this cooking trend only emerged after 2008. Before the recession, cooking followed the same pattern as housework, with out-earned men doing relatively little of it. Cooking is not seen as being as intertwined with masculinity as housework, the casinos write. Preparing food can easily involve the use of specialized equipment and techniques, a craft that men can be proud of their prowess in. Indeed, in another recent study of men who cook, the participants saw cooking as a type of work leisure, not quite one or the other. The ones who had few or no childcare responsibilities were more likely to find it pleasurable, since they seemed to have more freedom to relax and take their time in the kitchen. The post-recession era has coincided with a rise in foodie culture, which might have contributed to men's growing interest in the culinary arts. Pushing a vacuum cleaner might seem a feat to American men, but post an expertly grilled steak on Instagram and you're practically Don Draper. To conclude, to wrap this video up, there are a lot of contributing factors as to why so many men don't have bed frames and why a lot of men care about their living space a lot less than women. Socialization, how much time they spend on their chores, how likely they are to be rewarded for doing their chores, for doing the bare minimum, receiving allowance for upkeep tasks like brushing their teeth and showering, parents being far more harsh on their daughters than their sons. And I think this socialization really contributes to the differences between men and women and how they treat their living space, why men are more likely to view a bed frame as a luxury rather than a necessity. And as women, we need to stop sweeping into men's lives and becoming their mothers, because we are not their mothers, we are their girlfriends, and we should be behaving as such. But all the responsibility of change cannot be placed onto women. Similarly, that real change can't just occur through the actions of men. Men changing their actions would make a hell of a lot of difference, don't get me wrong, but so much of this change actually lies in the way that this country is governed. Unfortunately, a lot of this inequity is just kickback from law. Of course, women are going to take on more housework because they get over 2 months more maternity leave than men do. And of course, women are more likely to put their careers on the back burner and quit their job because they were the ones that took the maternity leave, not the men. And they've spent more time with their child. They know their child better. They probably find parenting easier than their male partners. And of course, these women are going to put their careers on the back burner than returning to work when childcare is so ludicrously expensive in this country. A lot of families are being set up to fail, and the laws surrounding maternity, paternity, and childcare in this country are completely doing families a disservice, and once again putting a vast majority of the pressure onto women. But yes, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This was actually, I know I say this at the end of all of my videos, but I had so much fun making this video because it started out with the bed frames and the navy bed sheets, and then it's turned to gender inequity, obviously. But yes, if you did enjoy it, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, let me know what you think, and I will see you soon for another video. Bye!